I want to thank Trisha, George, Jordan, Caitlin, Christina for putting together this wonderful event. Really humbled. George and Trisha have been guiding political and intellectual forces since like my sophomore year in college. So they've seen it all. They've seen me in my rawest form, and maybe I'll make them nostalgic today. We'll see. So I want to talk about this notion of the cultures of solidarity today. And in so doing, I want to come back to some points raised by George last night and Cindy this morning, this notion of new politics and new polities, and organizing around social reproduction. But before doing that, maybe I should just provide some framing. So I do Asian American studies through the transdiscipline of Black studies. And people often look at me funny when I say that, like, how do you do that? What does that mean? What it means is I don't do comparative ethnic studies. I don't look at like two groups and see how they're each doing within a given context known as, say, the nation state, because this assumes that the nation state is a stable entity that we understand and two different groups come into it and let's see how they're doing. Instead, I ask a different question. My question is, how can we better understand Asian American life by reading it within the context of slavery's afterlife? How do we better understand Asian Americans by understanding that they're not entering this kind of blank nation state, but really what Clyde Woods calls the blues tradition, right? At the same time, how might we better understand Black life, African American life, by reading it within an international frame, right? By understanding the ways in which Black life in the United States is always shaped by the imperial and colonial endeavors of the U.S. nation state abroad. What Clyde Woods, again, described as how the neo-plantation, right? The post-plantation has always been global. So that's how I approach my work. And today I'm going to talk about the Vietnamese Americans of Black New Orleans East. I'm going to get to it in a kind of a elliptical way, so bear with me. I'll begin by saying how I even got involved with that population, with that community. It wasn't my main research. What happened was I had gotten a call from a group of young people, activists down in New Orleans East, who were planning to take over, do a sit-in at a major landfill in the East to shut it down. And they got hold of this documentary that we did called Eating Welfare up in the Bronx, where before I was a professor, I was a community organizer. And in the documentary, it featured me and some young people we worked with doing a sit-in at a welfare center to shut it down. And here you had like these Cambodian and Vietnamese teenagers and their parents doing a sit-in and somehow not getting arrested. And they got hold of this documentary and they were like, how did you pull that off? Because we need to pull that off like in 2 weeks. So I flew down just to kind of give them some advice on how to do it. And it was a difficult situation because it's so far out east, for those of you who are familiar with Chef Montour Pass, that we weren't sure who had jurisdiction. Did like the Louisiana State Troopers have jurisdiction, or was it like NOLA PD? Because that would have made all the difference in terms of how these arrests were made and who got prosecuted by whom. So I spent about 2 weeks just helping them figure that out, and in the process, gained so much from them. I mean, what I did was, fine. I helped them figure out some legal stuff and some tactical stuff, but it was really, I was the beneficiary of their stories, and I was the beneficiary of what I later came to understand was this culture of solidarity that extended between and among Vietnamese Americans and their African American neighbors out east. So that's the genesis of this project. And what I thought I would do is begin by just giving some general information about the Asian population, the Southeast Asian population in the Gulf area. There are really three kind of resettlement communities that Vietnamese Americans came to: New Orleans, Biloxi, and Gulfport. And Bayou Batre, Alabama. And we call this a Deep South Triad. I could simply say the Deep South Triangle, but the Asian kids love the term triad, so I'll leave it in there. So these are the major areas where Southeast Asian refugees resettled. And What's interesting about these areas is that they actually do not conform to the new immigration model, the post-1965 model. So you see like a lot of new immigration over the past 30 years that comes to cities like Atlanta, Houston, so on and so forth. The folks who were in the Deep South triad, if you will, these three areas, are actually, for the most part, refugees, not folks who came to take jobs in the new industries of the Deep South, right? These are folks who were, for the most part, peasants from Vietnam and Cambodia, in much smaller numbers, the Cambodians. And they came as refugees, not as part of the ethnic economies of, say, Houston and Atlanta, all right? And so they don't really conform to the new immigration model, right? This notion that new immigrants come as a result of the post-1965 Immigration Act, and then they embed themselves within ethnic economies like Chinatown, Koreatown, so on and so forth. It's a much different situation. And what happens is you have this first generation of refugees, but then by the 2000s, the majority of the refugees are now the children of refugees. So the foreign-born population is actually pretty small. All right, we might say that the Southeast Asian refugees were the lone new immigrant event to the Deep South triad. All right, so what are the economic conditions? Well, poverty is extremely high among Vietnamese Americans in New Orleans, 31.7% compared to 27.9% for the city as a whole. Am I on that slide? Economic conditions? Okay, this thing's kind of got a life of its own here. You have also similar high poverty rates in Mississippi and Alabama, the other two pieces of the Deep South triad. Most of the refugees are involved in the fishing and shrimping industry. The Vietnamese Americans account for 1/3 of all commercial seafood workers in the Gulf Coast, or at least they did before the BP incident, oil spill, and here we're on that slide. And so these multiple disasters, Hurricane Katrina, the BP spill, these had a deep impact on the economic livelihoods of refugees because so many of them were so deeply entrenched in the fishing and shrimping industry. So that's just some background. Okay. I guess the main takeaways are this isn't like other new immigration stories in other major cities, right? It's a specific refugee story, number one. Number two, it's connected to the fishing industry. And number three, poverty is the routine experience, not the exceptional experience of these refugees. Okay. And here it gives you a sense, the darker areas show you where there are higher concentrations of Southeast Asian refugees in relation to the BP oil spill, okay? And just to give you a sense of the impact of the oil spill on this community, the seafood industry as a whole lost over 6 million per year, and in Louisiana there was immediate loss of 4,000 jobs, permanent damage to the oyster beds. The Vietnamese Americans made up 1/3 of the entire shrimping fleet, and so obviously many of them lost their livelihoods. And by some counts, 80% of the Southeast Asian population in the Gulf Coast triad is tied to the seafood industry. So this just shows you what a singular impact these disasters had on this population. Okay, but let's talk about Katrina, the Katrina example in particular. There are three main, I guess, flashpoints or moments that I would say describe Vietnamese American activism post-Katrina. The first is the return to their historic neighborhoods in New Orleans East, known as Village de l'Est, and this is the name of the housing project that they were resettled to during the mid to late 70s. And this return happened almost relatively immediately after the storm. By September, October 2005, you had many residents already returning. Second was the opening or reopening of the Mary Queen of Vietnam Church, the parish out east. By November 2005, they held the first Mass. And it was the first, mass in New Orleans East after the storm. And then in 2006, the landfill struggle, which took shape between February 2006 and August 2006. And I'm going to focus on the landfill struggle and what that meant to the community, and from there get into this notion of the culture of solidarity. So what happened with the landfill is Mayor Nagin decided that he was going to put a third of the Katrina debris in a landfill out east along Chef Montour Pass. And he promised the community that it was fully lined and safe, but testing done on that landfill revealed that it actually was seeping toxins into the ground and poisoning the wetlands that surrounded the area. And at first, the Vietnamese American community felt like they should do its part, and like if there needs to be a landfill, the debris has to go somewhere. They didn't really fight it. But what happened was the environmental justice movement, led by primarily African American activists in the area, implored them to reconsider the mayor's offer and to fight the mayor's proposal. They said, let's test it, let's find out how toxic it actually is, and just some preliminary tests revealed that, in fact, it was poisoning the area. So immediately the leadership in the Vietnamese American community challenged the mayor's plan and demanded that the landfill be shut, and the mayor agreed. He agreed to shut it down by August 2006. But on the eve of that, on the eve of the day he was supposed to shut it down, he began to renege, right? And the community mobilized and said, if it's not shut down on the day that it was promised to be shut down, we are going to stage a major sit-in, a blockade, essentially, to prevent trucks from coming in and dumping on it. And it was a successful action. The trucks didn't come that day, and the landfill was shuttered. The question is, what role did the African American community play in this success, which was largely attributed to Vietnamese Americans? Well, there's a hidden story here, and that story is, again, one, the environmental movement led by African Americans were the major political force pushing Vietnamese Americans to take this position. Two, much of the litigation was done with the help of African American attorneys and civil rights groups that knew how to sue the state and the city around environmental justice. The Vietnamese Americans will be the first to tell you they didn't know anything about environmental justice, or at least how to litigate an environmental justice case, until the African American community leaders came along and described to them exactly what needed to be done. And three, what you had was the political leaders, from the grassroots leaders to the elected officials, standing outside of the landfill with the the Vietnamese American community, demanding that the landfill be shut. So it wasn't just like they were giving them advice on how to litigate this thing and on how to test the soils, but they were out there on the ground, shoulder to shoulder with Vietnamese Americans. And what I would argue is that Vietnamese Americans saw in African Americans something of themselves in this process, in these engagements. And they understood that the legacy of the environmental justice movement in New Orleans, led by African Americans, in many ways resembled their own legacies around the demand to stay rooted, the demand to claim one's home beyond economic incentives, beyond what seemed irrational. And I'm going to turn to three key dates in order to explain what this form of resilience and rootedness is all about. The Vietnamese Americans of New Orleans East have actually been traveling with each other since 1954, when they were displaced from the north as a Catholic population that, although was not sympathetic to French colonial rule in Vietnam, nevertheless feared the kind of retaliation that the Revolutionary Nationalist forces would take against them for being Catholics. They weren't sympathizers, but they were also Catholics. And so they moved to the south, where the Vietnamese revolutionaries had less control. And they remained there in 1970 until 1975 through the US war. when Saigon fell and the South went to the revolutionary forces entirely, they moved yet once again, this time to the United States with the help of the Catholic Church. And the Archbishop of New Orleans invited them to come to New Orleans. He said, look, it's a seafaring place. It's got a tropical condition. Y'all will do great here. And they accepted the offer. Okay? And so in 2000, from 1975 to 2005, they remained in New Orleans East, having been displaced by 2 wars in Southeast Asia. And then Hurricane Katrina happens, right? And in their view, they had seen this before. They had been displaced and dispossessed as a community before, and a hurricane certainly wasn't going to be the reason that they broke apart as a population, right? They had seen this. They understood what displacement and dispossession meant, okay? And this is how they understood resilience and rootedness. And we might say in that sense they're model minorities of a different sort. Model minorities who, are not so much about economic success, but about staying rooted, okay? And I would argue that they saw in their African American neighbors some resonance, some cross-racial resonance. They saw that African Americans were also returning to New Orleans when all, conditions economically suggested that they shouldn't, right? And I won't get into the data that describes, how many African Americans to the East actually returned. I mean, this is the thing that we're not, that many studies don't pay careful attention to. The notion that many of the African Americans out East did return, and I think at a rate commensurate to the Vietnamese Americans, if you look at the damage that those neighborhoods in the African American parts of New Orleans East actually sustained. They also understood that there was Hurricane Betsy prior to Hurricane Katrina in August of 65, and many of their African American neighbors talked about how they had been through this before and how they returned, and they would return once again. And here I want to turn to one of Kalamu's quotes that I thought was fascinating. I don't know if you remember it, but you talked about how during Betsy, many people were involved in this conspiracy theory that the levees had been blown up purposefully, and you wrote, well, I'm not a card-carrying member of the Negro Conspiracy League, but who needs conspiracies to understand just brutal class warfare? And I thought that was brilliant because, a lot of folks who survived Betsy were saying, yeah, it doesn't matter if they blew up the levees purposefully in 65. What they were doing to us during that period was bad enough. And what I want to suggest is that Vietnamese Americans coming from their own war, because I think the war you're describing is not metaphorical but real, saw in their African American neighbors people who had been battling it out for decades and were staying despite this low intensity of warfare. This wasn't something that was exceptional but routine. And so there was this resonance around return and resilience that was rooted not so much in this desire to return for economic reasons, but rather a desire to return because embedded in these communities was a culture of solidarity, right? And I'll describe the culture of solidarity by invoking 3 points. It's a rootedness based on historical struggle against the violences of capitalism, white supremacy, imperialism, right? As opposed to a rootedness based on some economic rationale. Okay, it's not market-driven, right? We're not staying because of the equity in our homes necessarily. And we might say that refugees in particular understand that they're in New Orleans not because, they were escaping socialism so much as they were escaping the wars against it, right? The violences against, the violence perpetrated by the United States. And it's not incidental that they therefore wind up in another war zone, right? And this war zone being the war that Kalamu talks about, right? This ongoing warfare against black life in New Orleans, okay? 2, that the culture of solidarity is not about politics with a big P, right? These electoral kind of coalitions or, coalitions negotiated between organizations, but perhaps what Cindy was talking about earlier, a kind of politics that resides at the level of social reproduction, right? Everyday life. Young people who extend gestures of solidarity in schools, right? neighbors who extend gestures of solidarity, like using the Queen of Mary of Vietnam Church for the first Black Mass in New Orleans East, right? So it's everyday gestures of solidarity. And finally, I would say that it's a sense of it's a culture of solidarity that recognizes the need to stay rooted in communities. Not for economic reasons, but because to avoid the trauma of dispossession, what Dr. Mindy Fullilove calls root shock, right? The way in which when communities are uprooted, they experience forms of trauma that will extend for generations on end. And so that's what I see as the culture of solidarity that cross-resonated between African Americans and Vietnamese Americans, allowing for the types of solidarities that we saw post-Katrina. The last thing I'll say in the 30 seconds, do I even have 30 seconds? Am I done? Am I baked? Okay. Is that despite all this evidence on the ground of African Americans and Vietnamese Americans working together and working through this culture of solidarity, neoliberalism can't account for it. And you see this in a New York Times op-ed that came out just last month on the 10th anniversary, where this researcher, whose research is actually good around Vietnamese Americans and how they're dealing with trauma, and the reasons for why they're doing well as a population. On the one hand, the research, the data is sound, but the analysis is still within the neoliberal frames. And so, sentences like the Vietnamese are experiencing are doing great. They're thriving despite experiencing the same Katrina-related hardships as other groups. It's just not a true statement. What happened out in the Vietnamese community in New Orleans East was much less severe than what happened in the Ninth Ward. We know this, and yet a statement like that gets to pass as if it's factual. Specifically, those who came to the United States were wealthier than those who stayed behind in Vietnam. Again, not true. If you actually study the class background of the people who came, they're largely peasants. Granted, by and large, the first wave refugees who came in '75 were more privileged, but that wasn't the case in the Deep South Triad. And yet, the New York Times publishes it as if it's fact. And finally, this statement, that comes off as just pure data, right? We find that Vietnamese Americans are doing better because, unlike their African American neighbors, they enjoyed a favorable social image, which encouraged people to offer resources to speed their recovery. And then he quotes this one person who says, "I personally was very happy to have the Vietnamese refugees come here because they wanted to live their lives, improve their lives, and wanted to be part of the general society. They didn't try to, like I said, they weren't there for handouts." And if you think about the unprecedented death and destruction wrought upon African Americans during Katrina, how does a statement like this stand as not a blatantly racist statement, but it comes across as data, This is why they're doing well. And so I just want to harken back to George's presentation last night about how the neoliberal frame is shot through in our contemporary research. Even when we produce data that might be on its own sound, we immediately only have the language of neoliberalism to understand it, right? And that might be the challenge for us in the room today. How do we rescue some of this data, right, from the neoliberal frame? And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
I'm Shana Griffin. I'm going to do some exercising this morning because I can't see. And I didn't print out some notes, and I'm going to click. So I want to make sure I'm not giving y'all the wrong slide. So I am very grateful for being here. I am very excited. Where's Jordan? Thank you, Jordan, for reaching out to me, following up on the email that I got from Tricia. Thank you so much for inviting me. And George, thank you so much for almost doing most of my presentation last night. So I feel like part of this is some additional talking points to what you presented last night. And also I feel like it's somewhat of a follow-up, a reflective follow-up conversation that I started with Clyde was 6 years ago. And so my goal is to share with you all some key frameworks that I have been organizing from for the past almost, I guess, 10 years. But more, so it's like 4 pieces. 2 are something I've been thinking about more recently. 1 especially, I guess I should say. But I want to present it as a reflection and what I'm thinking about, and open for feedback and conversation. And there are a few things that I won't talk about that I'm also have been pondering with, but I can discuss those later if there's any questions, if people are curious about what that is. And I'm very grateful for my daughter who's here with me, who's been pretty chill and awesome. So thanks, Zora. So Hurricane Katrina and policies that make people go away. I'm reflecting on structural policies of neglect and the violence of disposability. Try to just stand here and work it from here. If I click here. Okay. So the goal, is it still morning? Yes. I have about 15 to 20 minutes to reflect on the concept of reproductive violence and its historical trajectory, explore the meaning of population control policies of everyday life, to highlight public disappearance as neoliberal disposability, and to examine the relationship between carcerality and recovery. I'm gonna try to do that in 15 to 20 minutes. We'll see how it goes, but I might try to move really fast. I have some slides, I wanna give some examples, but we'll just see what happens. I hate when people start conversations off with August 29th, and I'm about to do the same thing. But we all know that August 29th didn't invent or create New Orleans, nor did it invent or create many of those of us who are presenting today. Is a reflection of our organizing, our work, and much of it has started way before then. But August 29th is also a historical day and moment. For me, it's a day in which a massive number of people along the Gulf Coast begin to disappear. From the abandonment and criminalization of an entire city to the loss of approximately 140,000 housing units, to the desertion of people held in prisons, to the elimination of the largest union in the state, to the demolition of over 4,000 public housing apartments, and the death of over 2,000 people. The number is normally at 18,033. Some people say 1,836, but that number is in debate. I've heard numbers as high as 4,000. Thinking about those who were missing, there's, I believe 705 people who have not been accounted for, as well as over 2,000 people who died within the first 6 months after Hurricane Katrina, much of which was directly connected to the storm itself. So we don't really know how many actually died. Also, thinking about this disappearance, we also have seen a permanent displacement of about 100,000 people or more. But basically, whole communities in the region simply vanish. The question I have is, who were the people who disappeared? What were the racial, gender, and geographic implications of their disappearance? What is the relationship between carcerality, disaster recovery, and social neglect? Talking like prisons, punishment, and I'm gonna get a little bit more into that. So the catastrophic disasters that followed the landing of the storm and the ensuing flooding of the city of New Orleans as a result of the failed federal levee protection became the face of global warming, of Black suffering, of unmitigated climate change, of abandonment, environmental degradation, years of social neglect and systemic inequality, as well as sensationalized and irresponsible sexist journalism. Militarization of the city and law and order was the face of Katrina. I also just want to quickly note, we're talking about New Orleans. New Orleans is my home, it's my bias, but it hit the Gulf region. People in coastal Mississippi and Alabama get very upset when we do not acknowledge people even in southeast Louisiana. So I just want to hold myself accountable to that. Despite the extended around-the-clock coverage, the national dialogue on Katrina paid little or no attention in some cases to the racialized gender forms of inequality and vulnerability experienced by women of color, trans, and gender nonconforming people in the region. And 10 years later, this is still the case. The systemic and institutional invisibility has proven disastrous on many levels, creating what I'm calling like a socio-political storm in the lives and on the bodies of Black women in the region, particularly people in New Orleans, which have compounded our continual struggle against intersecting forms of structural oppression in the context of displacement, eugenic legislation, limited access to health care, persistent poverty, state and interpersonal violence, punitive social policies, housing discrimination, and unrelenting environmental threats. It is through this frame that my activism shift, starting in about 2006, to a focus on reproductive violence and the multiple ways it is used to regulate and police the lives of those existing and operating through identities and locations of subjugation, and how shifting economic policies shape our access and influence conditions under which our agency is exercised, determining, who can live, under what conditions, and how. So, in terms of reproductive violence, I thought I was really I was excited. I was like, oh, I got this term, reproductive violence. And right when I started writing about it, reproductive violence as a concept also started to emerge in a sort of anti-violence movement, where people were talking about the ways in which intimate partners or former partners control people's reproduction, either by forcing them or threatening them to give birth, or if they find themselves pregnant, to force and intimidate them to terminate. And I was like, oh man. But I decided to stick with it. And I think that's an important work to think about another form of the way in which interpersonal violence manifests itself, but it also has some limitations if we just see it only in the context of anti-violence work. And so for me, reproductive violence refers to the methods used to sustain reproductive oppression and reproductive subjectivity. And Dr. Roberts' book, Killing the Black Body, I believe that was released in 96 or 97, she talked extensively about reproductive oppression, specifically as it relates to the black body and slavery and its afterlife. And what I'm attempting to do here is to extend out. A lot of times we talk about violence and oppression as if they're interchangeable. And so I'm really like, so we know what reproductive oppression is, well, what is the violence? And for me, the reproductive violence is the methods used to sustain such oppression. And it includes policies and laws and initiatives. It includes behaviors and practices and procedures designed to reduce, control, and or eliminate the reproductive autonomy of marginalized communities, as well as actions, beliefs, and practices to regulate and repress our sexuality. It's kind of a big thing, but it's supposed to be big, so it's not too narrow, but it all comes down to reduce, control, and or eliminate. Katrina allowed me to see this. And in doing research and looking through many different texts, I was inspired by some work of a Black feminist. She was doing something similar to what I was doing. I built off of some of her research and developed this table thinking about how we understand reproductive violence through specific U.S. economic periods. And so here, there are no dates on it because the goal is if I put dates on it, then people assume that once one stops, then something else starts. And the way reproductive violence works, there is always ongoing, right? And so in 2010, when the country and a lot of feminists and reproductive rights and reproductive health feminists was getting really upset and said, I've never seen it this bad in terms of austerity measure, in terms of the tax on Planned Parenthood, which we are cycling back now to 5 years later, in this idea of standing with Planned Parenthood. And I was like, well, I'm gonna stand on the side, just watch what happens. But when we take a historical perspective, we recognize that reproductive violence or the attacks didn't just start in that moment. it started with the formation of the U.S., which is why I have the U.S. in quotes, in terms of the conditions in the society that existed that led to the U.S. formation itself and what was ongoing. So when we think about the colonial period and what was sort of like the political economy at that time, we're thinking about like mercantilism and what was the dominant reproductive strategy. It was really about genocide and conquest. And we can see like the genocidal policies that included sexual violence, disease, and systemic killing of Native women and children during massacres to complete the extermination, to this idea of devaluating Native women's role in their community. And if you can control Native women, you can have control of Native land. Thinking about gaining that control, the reproductive control of Native women to control the land, and also you saw this loss of Native women's autonomy. We see the same dynamic when we think about chattel slavery. The sort of like strategy at the time was totally exploitative, where we are controlling the reproductive of black women to reproduce workers for the production of profit, to build empire, to establish social order, this forced breeding, controlling reproduction in black motherhood, commodification of black bodies, cash value of reproductive capabilities, dehumanizing. And the list go on. And what's really striking here, when we take a historical perspective, we can see during those times when we think things are really good is when we're seeing the most horrific forms of violence taking place. So when we think about the Great Society or the post-civil rights era, this is where we see some of the most intense forms of sterilization targeted towards black women, Puerto Rican women, and indigenous women. We also see during this period, sorry, let me check. When we think about like the valuation, how black bodies has a certain value at one point in history, now it has no value absolutely. No value at all right now. So you have this surplus body. So you do anything you can to like eliminate, to control, to regulate. And so when we think about what's going on in the U.S., definitely impacts sort of like our reproductive capabilities, how those reproductive capabilities are challenged, or how the state try to gain control. So this is sort of like a big frame that I'm working from, and like really having a historical perspective, but also recognizing that these things continue, they keep going. And so when we think about this moment that we're in, like even right now when we think about welfare reform, this could be like considered like the late 60s, early 70s, the 80s, but it's not just welfare reform that we're talking about. We're thinking about like prisons, or the privatization of prisons. We're thinking about crack cocaine, thinking about what was going on internationally with structural adjustment policies, HIV/AIDS. So there's a lot of attacks that's happening, and then we can track what was the reproductive strategies or the response of the state that was occurring at that time. And we can see how the reproductive capabilities of women are sort of like, it's coercive. Like you have to do this one thing to get these resources. You have to do this, like you're a bad mother. You're encouraged to sort of like, you're on like this idea that you're only seeking benefits. You're only getting pregnant to seek benefits. Like it's like far removed from everything else that's going on in a society. It was like it's based on this one person or communities, like y'all are bad, y'all are dirty, and the state, is our responsibility that we have to come in and fix it. For folks who do like disability or critical disability studies, you can look at reproductive violence and this paternalistic role of the state, this ableist role of the state, whereby we are feeble-minded, more or less, so we don't have the ability to control our reproductive, so it's the responsibility of the state to come in. So this is one frame. When we look at state and social response, for me, this translates into what I call population control policies of everyday life. And you would notice this list is almost similar to the list that was shared last night. If we think about population control, not as this one thing that happens, but something that's ongoing, occurring all the time, nonstop. Normally when I do presentations, especially in the context of a classroom or a workshop, I ask, when you hear the word population control, what comes to mind? Most people say the one-child rule in China, or they name like forced sterilization. I say, give me more, and then, there's just like blank faces. But if we think about population control of everyday life, what makes it possible? How do we control populations? And again, population control policies are rooted in this idea or this belief that certain populations are responsible for problems related to the environment, the climate, the economy, social disorder. And this belief is connected and rooted in a eugenic ideology based on who's fit and unfit to reproduce. So when we think about Hurricane Katrina, for example, we can see one form of population control policy of everyday life is social neglect, abandonment, divestment. We can see this when we think about Rwanda, what happened in '94. Again, many countries, especially the US, knew what was going on, and we chose to turn our back. And the idea is like if you turn your back, if you just abandon the situation, the goal is hopefully it can get rid of itself, or you can come in later and justify whatever actions that you choose. We see this a lot with, we see this also when we think about AIDS in Africa. We think about the US-Mexican border. Like this idea, if you turn your back and ignore, the problem will take care of itself, right? Another good example is when we think about displacement and disposition, this idea of, how do we think about displacement, not just as it relates to gentrification, but how you can displace a community through war, through a failed development project, through prisons, where people are just forcefully gone. When we think about disenfranchisement, again, thinking about your citizenship status, voting rights, or the undermining of those voting rights, or residents' ability to participate, in a political campaign, or like decision-making in terms of how their neighborhoods will be rebuilt. I felt totally disenfranchised during Katrina, during this planning process, and there was, you have these neighborhood planning processes where you go in your neighborhood, you talk about all these things that you would like, and you're just thinking about these really lawfully great ideas. And one day I was talking to my partner, I was like, actually, I really, really want this thing, but if I say it, then I might be planning myself out of my neighborhood. So we found ourselves like voting against things that we would otherwise want, but we knew if we got it, then we would be out of there, right? So thinking about another way in which how we can also self-control, like engage in population control out of, I guess I would say, a need for safety, or out of fear, or engage in what we call sometimes silent protest, like the way in which Ray Nagin was reelected post-Katrina. Not that people wanted him, but this fear of there's 23 people on the ballot, most of whom are white, what's going on, right? We see also a good example of population control policies of everyday life is assimilation. We see this in queer communities, obviously in immigrant communities. We see this a lot in low-income communities, in housing policies, this idea that to assimilate, like if we can move poor people next to middle-income people, well, maybe they can learn to act right and be good citizens and have certain values, like if you would just assimilate and act right. But again, that's another strategy of controlling populations. The list can go on and on. I have many different examples, but this is one way to think about population control. 1 minute? This is one way to think about population control in a different way, but also like how it's always ongoing, nonstop, and it just becomes so normalized we don't even recognize it. So I'm going to move really fast. This is just a slide to show, this is one example of when we think about the environment, this idea, or what was mentioned last night about Richard Baker, this legislator in Louisiana. This is not in reference to Katrina, but this is to give you another example, another view of what this can look like. And it's, clearly says family planning changes everything. This idea of this green, pristine area, and it's going to get, without, family planning, it's going to destroy the environment. This is another example of what this place needs is more condoms. Now, this could have been from a result of a drought, of war, famine, environmental disaster, or it also looks like the way the streets looked in New Orleans after the storm with arsenic on the ground, but obviously what this place needs is condoms, right? This was not in reference to Katrina, but it is in reference to Katrina. The former Secretary of Education in 2005, William Bennett, made this comment: if you want to reduce crime, you could. If that were your sole purpose, you can abort every black baby in this country and your crime rate will go down. This is October 2005. almost, it was early October, so it was like a month and a half after the Katrina. But again, this is that sentiment, right? You can say the word, like if I say the word welfare, people think black, right? I can say the word looter, and people think, right? This was mentioned last night, just in terms of Alphonso Jackson. This idea of New Orleans is not going to be as black as it was before, referencing the demolition of public housing. This is another example with another former legislator of Louisiana. He proposed this idea of paying poor women $1,000 to be sterilized. This is in 2008. After the country bailed out Wall Street with this $700 billion bailout plan. But again, he's shifting the focus from corporate welfare to blaming poor women. He specified women on welfare and women living in public housing. Population control policies of everyday life are reinforced through controlling images, stereotypes, fear, scarcity tactics, criminalization, policing, and myths. Okay, you can see reproductive violence in these different social policies. I'm happy to give examples of what they can look like, but normally we think about reproductive violence only in the context of sexual and reproductive health policies, not in the context of climate change, environment, welfare, housing, or even corrections and public safety, basically prisons. So I'm down to like, can I just get an extra minute to just wrap this up? Thank you. All right, public disappearance as neoliberal disposability. Okay, we hate all things public, right? And Katrina is a classic example of how we basically got rid of our public education system as we know it. We destroyed public housing. We also destroyed our public health care system. Like many people in New Orleans, I went to public school. I lived in public housing for most of my life, and I was born at Charity Hospital, like most people in New Orleans. But this idea of the public being bad, anything public is bad, and if you utilize public resources, you are basically, people feel entitled to dictate how you can live, where you can live, and you're publicly blamed. The other problem with this, when we think about disposability in terms of people utilizing public resources, is this idea of public-private partnerships, right? And how nonprofits are part of the private sector, and how nonprofits not all have a social justice framework. The state used them to relinquish its responsibility, and how nonprofits become part of that neoliberal disposability plan. Just some examples. I'm gonna read it. Well, housing units discussed had 1 or 2 bedrooms. If occupancy standards were reinforced, the highly fertile elements will not live there. Still, population growth will adversely affect all of us, so those who oppose it have every right to do so. Again, this is that sense of entitlement. Whether we're talking about housing or education or healthcare or welfare, it all goes back to people's specific group of people, reproductive capabilities. And this is why reproductive violence is so important for us to think about it as a framework. What is this? Okay, I'm sorry, I'm walking away as I wrap this up. Ms. Sharon Jasper in New Orleans, a former resident of public housing and housing rights activist, made this comment in 2007. She said, I'm tired of being disrespected. I'm a black woman. If I gotta go to jail for what I believe in, if I gotta, I will not be treated like a slave. Wait, I'm sorry. If I gotta go to jail for what I believe in, if I gotta die for what I believe in, I will not be treated like a slave. I'm a human being, a United States citizen. Ms. Jasper is referencing specific historical moments in terms of the association between to be a black woman and to be disrespected. She's referencing like civil rights movement in terms of if I have to go to jail. She's also referencing like I will die for what I believe in. And we know people literally die to prevent harms that was targeted at them. She said, I will not be treated like a slave. Again, evoking that historical moment. Then she goes, I'm a human being. And then on top of that, to be a United States citizen is above being human. And her right as a citizen to engage and participate in the planning process of how her community can be redeveloped was denied her. I'm gonna stop there. And so I never made it to carcerality. Sorry, Kalamu, but we'll talk about it.
I'm going to try this so I can see. I'm Bill Quigley. It's an honor to be here. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Thanks for my fellow activists for being here and inspiring me over the years. I have a lot of slides, but I'm going to go pretty fast because you've seen a lot of them before. So first of all, it's just like the theme is who was left behind then, who's left behind now. This is the way that New Orleans evacuated was you get in your car and you leave. Well, that's great if you have a car. We have a quarter of our people don't have cars, and then it's a question of where you go, and whether you have gas, and whether you have a hotel, whether you have relatives in the suburbs or wherever, and a lot of us didn't have that. So when the storm hit, we had hundreds of thousands of people. It's ultimately 1 million people displaced by Katrina. Hundreds of thousands of homes, places underwater in New Orleans. And the way New Orleans is set up, as in most of our communities, there are certain areas of town that are less attractive, less economically attractive, and ends up being segregated. So that was, although white communities got flooded, African American communities got flooded worse, higher water, longer time, that sort of stuff. And who was left behind is this intersection of the ideas that we understand, and you can see the intersection in the people that we talk about. A lot of kids, a lot of elderly, a lot of disabled, a lot of poor people, a lot of moms, a lot of seniors, and going out as families, living on the interstate for days at a time, waiting to try to figure something out. The response of the white community and the property community was violence, naked state-sponsored violence. So we got a chance to see what a lot of times we don't get a chance to see, but that was very clearly, and this was, of course, privately purchased state violence in terms of the Blackwater folks. This is what the inside of the houses look like. We've talked about that before. So you had this facing people for whom most people, whether they're homeowners or renters, this is everything we've got. And if you're a homeowner, this is your entire investment. This is everything that your family put together forever, and that takes new wiring, new lighting, new everything. So what are the roles that we play? Race, key thing for us right from the beginning. I was stuck in New Orleans. I was in a hospital with my wife, who's an oncology nurse. The hospital was surrounded by 8 feet of water. And so we got to see people coming from the K&B, coming from the drugstore and that sort of stuff. So you saw people all the time going through the water. Questions came up real early, surviving or looting. And this is, I think, of the one slide, I think most of you have seen it, but maybe some of you haven't. The one slide that says more about the way the media framed what happened in New Orleans than anything else is the exact same thing happening in both pictures, but one is characterized as survival, one as a crime, when it's the exact same conduct. And that's, day one. The housing displacement, the patterns of segregation that we have. We have 2 neighborhoods in New Orleans, the Lower Ninth Ward and St. Bernard Parish. St. Bernard Parish is almost 100% white. Lower Ninth Ward is almost 100% black. They're separated by 100 feet, a railroad thing. And look at the difference in terms of how far people were displaced. Everybody was displaced, obviously, but look at the differences. That's 100 feet away and totally racialized difference in terms of where people ended up, how far people ended up away, and then as a consequence, how hard it is to get back. One of our first neighboring parish immediately put into effect an ordinance passed by the council there that would allow only rentals to blood relatives, which as a law professor is like unconstitutional about 6 different ways, so it would be an exam in and of itself. They knew it. They were very clear. Their lawyers told them, they said, we don't care. We just want to make sure that people don't move into our neighborhood. The other parish that joins us, Jefferson Parish, was very adamant from the very beginning about opposing even housing for the elderly because they didn't want the foot in the door that people would be displaced into the surrounding majority white parish. Across the lake, our other big suburban place, where the sheriff, an elected official, said this openly on television and was affirmed by the people in the metropolitan area where he was in charge of. So as a result, then you had essentially the African American community in New Orleans itself could not move in with relatives, could not move in with cousins and other folks who lived in the surrounding areas, as the white people of New Orleans could go 40 miles away or 20 miles away. But because of these very intentional policies and the like, people were displaced much further away for much longer times, and combine that with the geography, much more damage, it makes it much more harder for people to come back. As a result, we have you'll hear different numbers here, but clearly we're at like 100,000 less African American people in New Orleans than before, compared to many fewer whites. So any students in here, I can give you my email at the very end of this. So I'll give you the PowerPoint if you'd like to look at any of these numbers. So gender is right there as well, obviously. So public housing, which is one of our high-profile struggles, overwhelmingly mothers, grandmothers, folks that are in charge of the apartments, overwhelmingly low income. And were targeted, clearly targeted by elected officials, by other folks that said, we do not want you back. It was the only community in New Orleans where it was very clear, very open, we do not want people back. Other people would say, well, we'd like you back but, or we'd like you back if, or we'd like you back there instead of here or there, but public housing residents, it was clearly not doing that. The public schools immediately, the powers that be had the opportunity to do just as in public housing. It was an opportunity for people to swoop in and be able to do the transformation that they chose to do. We now have, instead of one school board in the city of New Orleans, we have 44 school boards. The problems for kids with special education issues, with disability issues, with parenting questions, and that tremendous problem. Choice is, as you'll hear much more about all this afternoon, choice is a great word, but choice doesn't really work if somebody else is in charge of what your options are. And so as a consequence of all this, and we had many people who within 18 months moved 9 times. First displaced to the convention center, then displaced by bus to Houston, to the Astrodome, then displaced to a hotel for a while till they cut off the hotels, then put into a FEMA camp, then put into another place. So the consequences on women and children particularly were enormous, and are consequences that we haven't begun to deal with in our communities. In the very earliest years, we had very little public transportation. We didn't have public schools. We didn't have public housing. We didn't have public health care. So how were people supposed to come back? How were people have a chance to do that? And as a result, women were clearly targeted by these processes. There's a recent report that was just announced by focusing on women in public housing. That's a great one for anybody who wants to do some further look at that. These are some of the things initially after that. Women with children just could not come back. If we didn't have schools, and didn't have housing, and didn't have transportation. So the impact on children, and again, this is, as others have said, the impact on a child of moving 9 times in 2 years, impact of children of the trauma on your mother, the impact of children on you don't have a house anymore, you don't have your neighbors, you don't have your doctor, you don't have your church, you don't have all these other things, is something that we are just beginning to see and get the attachment to, the understanding of. Poverty in New Orleans today is higher than it was when Katrina hit, and we were poor then, but it's actually worse today. The children mothers and children have not come back, as you can just look at some of the tens of thousands of people less in the public school system. And it's not because they went to private school systems, it's because they weren't able to get back. Did some people choose not to come back? Certainly. We all know that. That did happen. But what choice do you have if you don't have a house and you don't have a school and you don't have health care and you don't have these other things? The elderly and disabled, this is a picture from the hospital where I was. until we were out of there, where it was hotter in the hospital than it was outside. And this was August, the end of August. So it was 100 and something degrees inside. So the elderly and disabled were victimized officially, unofficially, medically, and alike, so that we have 1,800 officially died. We have hundreds missing, but every family has experienced what we call the aftershock deaths of people who maybe were able to get out, but when they came back and found their neighborhood was destroyed, they just gave up. My wife, as a nurse, says they say it was the equivalent of 10 years of stress. And not everybody had 10 years, right? So a lot of people, we had the aftershock deaths. So the economics of this pull all of these things together, the race, the age, the gender, and that. The vultures that we had and still continue to have are unbelievable. So there was, tens of millions to be made. We had what we call as a 2% rule, which was of the money, because everybody, when I would go places or go home, they'd say, well, we're sending all this money, we're doing all this stuff. How come it's not, it's not showing? And the reason is because we didn't get it. It didn't go to the people. It went to the corporations who were there for this. And I have one example that I'd like to give you. Blue tarps. So I don't know if you know what blue tarps are, but I'm sorry, it's moving too fast. Almost every house in New Orleans was covered with blue tarps right after this thing happened. And it turns out that this was a gigantic ripoff of incredible proportions. So these are real names of real groups. The Shaw Group, which is an international corporation, got $175 a square, and a square is a 100-foot square. So you put several squares on a house. They got the 175. They subcontracted out to A1 Construction. These are real names. This is not made-up names, and this is all part of it. They subcontracted out to 75 a square. So they immediately make $100 by doing nothing, right? They don't have a thing. Who in turn turns it around and subcontracts it down and down and down to the guys who actually work on the roof and who are making $2 a square. So it started $175 per square, ends up at $2, and people made tons of money all along the way. And most people weren't even there to even ask for the tarp to put on their roof, right? So it was somebody's idea. It was a great idea. This one I love particularly. Ashbridge got a $500 million contract to pick up the trash disposal and stuff in Mississippi. They didn't own a single truck. Okay? They were just in the business of disaster capitalism, of coming in there, and they turned around and they subcontract and subcontract and subcontract till you see the people going. The FEMA people, the people who gave us formaldehyde and all those things, they were given no bid, $250 million contract. They had filed bankruptcy the year before. They didn't even have a website, right? But they were in charge of expediting and doing all this sort of stuff. So what does the president do? Suspends prevailing wages, this thing is really sensitive, suspends affirmative action right off the bat, import white outsiders to do the work. People from all over the place were doing the heavy duty work. Literally imported and recruited tens of thousands of migrant workers, undocumented people, to come in and do the worst, most dangerous work, the people that most people shouldn't be doing without tremendous amount of equipment and the like, and then set us up against each other while they did that. I'm going to pass that. The privatization we've talked about, and you're going to talk some more out. The public hospital saw 350,000 people a year, closed it, let it sit there, still sitting there, and chose not to fix it up, even though the people who had run it had fixed it up enough so that it could start seeing people. 5,000 public housing units demolished, great opportunity for them. Now we have a full third of our people spend more than 50% of their rent on income, and of the private places that we have, they're in tremendously bad shape, right? This is, again, the intersection of these various things, how the economy shows it up. Okay. You could see the median income, white and black, obviously was very bad beforehand, but has accelerated in the 10 years since. Accelerated. So the gap of inequality in New Orleans, like the rest of the United States, like the rest of the world, is accelerating. The poor are staying the same, and the rich are getting much, much richer. So median income for black families in 10 years, 7%, 3 times as much for white families in the city. So the lessons are, gosh, it's really fast, sorry. That the exact people who were left behind when Katrina hit, who you could see on television, I didn't see, we didn't have television where I was, but you could see, and people could see, the people who were left behind then are being left behind now, and for many of the exact same reasons. So there's a couple lessons in here, I think, particularly for the students and the people who are interested in changing the world. And that is, obviously, any one of these things is important, but it is the way that they're intertwined that accelerates the impact of them. And so all of us have to focus on all of those. This thing is so important. I've spent time on death row. I've been to Haiti many, many times. I've been to Iraq and that. And you would think that where the terrible things are happening, that there is depression, there is overwhelming fear and that stuff. But what you find, and what you find from the people that you share with here today, is that at the exact point where things look the bleakest because of outside, there are people who are organizing, who are sharing, who are cooperating, who are courageous, who are doing just unbelievably great things. So that whatever outsider we are, because of our geography, our education, our race, our gender, or whatever, there is a place to go ahead, as the professor told us last night, Ella Baker, find out who's doing what and go join them. Because people in New Orleans are happy to have folks join them. Not happy to have people come in and tell us what to do, right? This is just something I wanted to show because it's one of our speakers this afternoon. This is our Black Lives Matter in New Orleans, circa 1980, and it's just part of the tradition. So the tradition is resistance. There's resistance happens every place that you look. And on all of these things, that the first thing that people do and the source of energy is resistance. But we run this risk as social justice people, I think, of being, the social justice cranks, or, the people that at Thanksgiving say, oh, I suppose you don't want to watch football because you probably just want to talk about incarceration or something, But I think it is important for us to, like Malik showed us this morning, to be joyful and critical and eyes wide open at the same time, so that we have to be open to the pain and injustice, but we have to be open to the joy and the love and the inspiration that's out there. And guess what? TV is not going to show us the inspiration and the joy and the love. They're just going to show us whatever sells that stuff. And what most people do is they just shut out both of those. I will watch football, and that's all I'm going to do. I'm not going to look at anybody's pain, but I'm also not going to be open for the joy and the love. But we have to do that. And we have many, many opportunities. You're hearing some of them today, but there's a lot more of those. This one, I think, sort of last point is, as Malik and Malcolm and Kalamu and everyone will tell you, we had tens of thousands of people that came to help us. We had almost 5,000 law students who came over the course of time, and they were terrific. But there is a but, right? And there is a but on all of us whenever we're going to do this work, and that is that we have to really, sure I did the right thing, okay, back. Yes, this thing, which is an old a slogan of people, indigenous folks in Australia, about it is, don't come thinking you're going to help us. And we say that to each other. We're not here to help each other. We are here to engage with each other in the struggle for liberation. And I don't care where you live or what job you have, we all need this liberation. And we can learn it from each other by doing it. We have part of our resistance and our liberation is bound up with art and culture and opportunities that we have there. I'll give my email address out to anybody who would like a copy of this thing. It's Quigley, Quigley, 77 @gmail.com, and I'll give it later if you want, because there was supposed to be one more slide. But thank you very much. Enjoyed talking.